At least nvidia wasn't lying with this slogan. This is an urgent video for every gamer and developer to watch if they want a pro-consumer graphics industry. This video was supposed to be an 8-minute video, but at this point where I have already edited the main analysis and conclusions, this video is ending up way beyond what I wanted to manage. Stick with me because I have to undo almost a decade of Nvidia's bullcrap marketing in so little time. I'm going to have to rush through this intro to get you up to speed. It has been very evident that we perfectly predicted the state of the industry 2 years ago, and we talked about Epic Games' compensatory IP acquisitions for their lackluster demos. The demo that was being referenced was this Star Wars Ray Traced Reflections demo that was riddled with horrible compensatory effects like blur, film grain, chromatic aberration. On top of that, it wasn't even very performant, and we can see, in this forcibly paused shot, this pathetic demo was using 2 vendor-locked technologies. Vendor-locked API reflections, pushed by NVIDIA, and DLSS. That's right! The demo is not even running at a native resolution. So here we can take off the vendor-locked image quality, which looks like blurry crap anyway. Now let's see how much the reflections cost. Keep in mind, they are running at a quarter rate of the native resolution, and as you can see, it's a massive 8 millisecond cost. That's so-called hardware-accelerated reflections. Note the SSR kicked in, which disrupts you from getting a more accurate timing measurement for RT reflections. But let's go back to native resolution and check out the performance with the defaulted checkerboarded RT reflections. These RT reflections now basically cost the same as Half-Life Alyx and Days Gone running at more than 60 FPS on our hardware setup. You need to see that crappy performance, because the rendering ratios were synchronized with this demo, which by default renders at native resolution, uses superior vendor-agnostic image quality, pretty much runs 3 times faster the entire time in a much larger environment, while using vendor-agnostic ray-traced reflections. This video will show you exactly how this project is rendered, why it has been tested improperly by most influencers, why things in this demo are actually completely unoptimized so that real-world optimized games can achieve better performance. We will discuss how the so-called drawbacks of this demo are actually shared across different hardware ray tracing implementations, and raise market value for this type of ray tracing in games, in order to balance out the horrendous and constantly pushed narratives and standards adopted by ignorant influencers and GPU benchmark publishings. As a quick note, I have not been working on this video in the last 2 months. In this video, I'll be talking about vendor-agnostic ray tracing in great detail. This was the video I felt we as the graphics industry needed so badly 2 months ago, but instead an earlier look at another topic was voted in by our Patreon members. That is the video I have been working on in the past 2 months. And it's basically the video you're watching now, but it discusses almost every single aspect of rendering. I had to take a break from that project because working on the same project for 2 months, now even into the 3rd month, it really exhausted my patience and I felt very burnt out. Thank you all for your support. Enjoy the next 22 minutes of discussion, and I'll try to pack in as much data and common sense conclusions at the end, because now this video is getting so long and it's stressing me out, so yeah, let's just go ahead and get to it. Alright, so here's the frame we're going to analyze. This frame was chosen because it renders a lot of different things, like tons of on-screen geometry. Obviously, we've got a good shot of reflections, including very important glass reflections. We have our animated object in view, which is the drone in the upper right. It has a lot of emissive materials, and we have some depth of field in the far back. So this is the GPU pipeline for that frame. And the first thing that it does is use 2 quads to clear some parts of this 4K by 4K D32 shadow map atlas. As you can notice, the corner changes in the top left. Then the GPU proceeds to use hardware clears for these buffers. It clears the main scene depth, some volumetric fog resources, and the motion vector buffer. This pipeline saves performance by not clearing the base pass resources, but loses some performance by clearing these 3. The R8 goes completely unused in this pipeline, and the RGBA8 and RGBA16 buffers are completely overwritten with hardware resource copying in the next draws they're used in. Now, the next step encompasses the majority of this pipeline by rendering geometry into deferred G-buffers. The albedo alpha is completely blank, but it's probably reserved for opacity values typically used by skin or plant materials. And while normals are usually stored in 32-bit formats like RGBA8 or preferably in RGB10A2, normals here are packed in an RGBA16 along with additional material tags in the alpha. The alpha normal map mostly stores information related to glass/window materials, all sharing the same value. Some curb/concrete materials use a third value, as you can see in the darker gray areas. The best way to analyze the optimization of this pass is by analyzing the individual efficiency of the pixels rendered. In this view, short wide draws render the pixels at the lowest cost, such as this draw. This is the most efficient material rendered in the base pass. This highlighted section in the albedo buffer displays what surface area this draw worked on. For clarification, most of the objects in this scene are values rendered from the previous frame. If we look at the depth buffer when this mesh was drawn, the solid objects are the meshes that rasterized before draw 12. Later draws, like this very unoptimized floor piece, fill the buffers simultaneously with current frame data. Now I want to quickly remind viewers of hardware Z testing, which is why this mesh was not rendering pixels in the corner despite the mesh boundary. The hardware is simply using the depth values provided by pre-existing draws to prevent shading behind already rendered objects. That's why clearing the depth buffer at the start of the frame is so much more important than clearing the other deferred G buffers. But moving on, I want to show why these two materials perform so differently, even though they render pretty much the same amount of pixels. Now, none of the materials in this demo are particularly optimized. At the very most, you want to sample 3, maybe 4 textures if it's a really complex material. It's one of the reasons why I can't stand light maps. We have videos on our channel discussing what formats these textures should be, but one of the things I'll clue you in on is that a single BC5 texture is crazy expensive compared to reasonable alternatives, and many materials are using more than just a single BC5 texture. There's also other issues with how these are packed. There are some draws like 338 that have a more reasonable layout, but the majority of materials in this demo are like this, and it's not super clear if it's because it's a rushed project or if they built it this way for so-called benchmark purposes, to, stress test systems a bit more. But that would have been a very stupid thing to do because many people went to go test this demo to get a taste of how performant hardware agnostic RT could be. Anyways, what I want to show here is that half the base pass cost comes from these highlighted draws, and the pink surface area represents the minimal amount of pixels these draws shaded. I say minimal because this view mode won't show what these in-between draws may have shaded over. This overdraw view mode is really the best thing to determine the contribution of those, but what you need to see is that by the end of the base pass, lots of that super expensive material surface area is overwritten by later draws, indicated by blue surface area. About 21% of the most expensive materials are overwritten by later draws. There are popular, documented ways to optimize this problem, such as only rendering the depth of these objects first, because non-textured depth-only rendering will perform at least 80% faster while providing valuable occlusion data for later draws, and then rendering these objects with their textured materials again at the end of the geometry pass, which will limit material processing to the scene's final depth surface area. The lack of a partial prepass is extremely detrimental to this demo's performance, and we'll see more examples of this later on. At the end, animated objects are rendered in the base pass with that additional motion vector RG16. Afterwards, a pixel shader is used to copy the native 24-bit hardware depth into a native 32-bit R32 float buffer. That native R32 float is then used to output an unused half-resolution 540p D24 and depth downscaled RGBA16, with the different channels containing different depth data like minimum, maximum 2x2 pixel values and other depth discontinuity information. That half-resolution RGBA16 depth discontinuity buffer is then used to create a 135p RGBA16 and 135p D24, which will be used for light culling later on. The hardware depth is used again to create a high Z followed by a decal pass, which does not use any additional buffer inputs for projection. Those two reserved 256 by 256 spaces in the shadow map have information rendered inside of them. Then the normal map RGBA16 data is copied into that uselessly cleared resource discussed earlier. Then that native R32 depth and copied normal map RGBA16 are used as additional inputs for box projection decals. The normal map RGBA16, albedo buffer, and remaining RGBA8 PBR buffer are copied into identical buffers to act as inputs, along with the hardware depth stencil channel and native depth R32 for a rain projection pass. Not a whole lot is changed in the normal and albedo buffer. The impact is more noticeable in the main PBR data buffer. The inputs are designed with tiling in mind, along with an aerial interior exclusion texture. Then, the native depth R32, normal map RGBA16, RGBA8 PBR buffer are used along with specific resources, including an uncompressed PBR texture pool to software raytrace low roughness pixels. 4 different 760p RGBA16s are produced with different deferred rendering alike values. The last RGBA16 contains 16-bit precision depth in the alpha. The other buffers contain values in their alpha channels as well, which is shown here in reverse sequential order. Now you should note a few things here. This software ray tracing is done with a compute shader. For many years, actions on the GPU were limited to the rasterization pipeline. For instance, when the GPU copied the 24-bit depth hardware to the 32-bit R32 buffer, the developers had to draw a triangle which used 3 vertex shaders, which basically cost nothing, and they had to draw that triangle over every pixel so that a pixel shader that contains the precision shifting copying logic was invoked for each pixel. This was a 1080p buffer, so about 2.7 million pixel shaders were invoked, and that's where most of the cost comes from for this draw. Compute shaders don't need triangles to shade pixels, nor do compute shaders even have to shade pixels. Compute shaders are a vendor-agnostic functionality that allows developers to use the raw parallel processing power of the GPU for any abstract computation, like updating animation skinning, particle logic, which is what some of the beginning compute shaders in Dead Space Remake do. Compute shaders were mainstreamed by the 8th console generation, which is why 7th gen focused productions like Crysis 3 don't have compute shaders in their pipeline. It is through compute shaders that will allow any shader Model 5 GPU, regardless of the vendor, to utilize its raw processing power for ray tracing. As discussed earlier, we captured the demo with very high settings enabled, which provides a unique advantage over alternative scalability options. Most ray-traced engines/games will provide native resolution tracing on high-end scalability options, but these perform terribly regardless of the engine or implementation. So they will typically provide a lower ray tracing option that will trace at a half resolution, which means it's a 3 times smaller RT buffer, which means the spatial upscaling will look extremely pixelated and require 4 different frames with little variance in motion to be temporally accumulated to a native-like RT image, which will never happen in basic gameplay. This demo renders the scalability RT buffer at a 30% lower resolution than native. This is basically equivalent to checkerboard tracing, depending on how buffer formats are handled by the engineers. But these two have great coverage that pairs well with spatial upscaling to prevent an overly pixelated output, and only requires 2 frames to resolve. It's a proper balance between performance and visual quality. Unreal Engine eventually implemented checkerboard traces in newer versions. The last thing to note here is what appears to be transparent glass materials have their interior and exterior ray traced through an interlaced pattern. We can see low roughness surfaces are traced in a uniform fashion based on input normals, but these windows have alternated lines. Every even and odd line contains the exterior and interior reflections. This is easier to understand if we use another shot in the demo. We can see in the window material the exterior RT reflection of the neon sign, but we can see the blinds behind the window. Those blinds do not exist in the deferred G buffers, only the window mesh does. So when the software RT comes around, if the pixel is tagged with that window material flag, every other vertical line will trace the exterior reflections where the neon sign and other objects appear. Then, the remaining vertical lines trace the interior to show the blinds behind the glass. The results are then temporally reconstructed to produce the final image. This is an interesting way to ensure reflections on transparent materials. A small compute shader processes some tiled lighting parameters, which are used in the next full-screen triangle tile deferred shading draw, which lights the RT resources. The main RGBA16 output resolves the interlaced window materials, and the alpha contains RT depth information. The second RGBA16 output purpose is a little more unclear, but it only contains information regarding the exterior reflections and contains a luminance map in the alpha. These two outputs are used along several native resolution G buffers and RT accumulation buffers for temporal reconstruction. Two of the buffers look pretty much identical and are saved for the next frame's temporal reconstruction step. Two of the outputs simply hold a temporally accumulated result, with extra information stored in the alpha, and are used with two native resolution G buffers to upscale the reflections to a native resolution RGBA16, with the alpha containing some type of roughness-related parameter. The noisy SSDO is shaded in this draw. The RGBA8 output is passed through a depth-aware blurring pass that stores the result in the normal map RGBA16 copy buffer. This 50 microsecond stage downsamples the albedo scene color for an SSDO color bleeding resource. This will give SSDO more of an SSGI look, but I don't typically care for albedo buffer downsampling over lit scene downsampling. Two lists are cleared and are updated accordingly by these draws that render geometric light bounds against a downscaled D24 resource, and uses the smallest depth discontinuity RGBA16 as input. While I probably won't end up promoting tile deferred shading for reasons that will hopefully be explained in the next video, this light culling method seems to be much faster than compute-based methods seen in other pipelines, so we'll definitely want this investigated more. Some new resources are cleared, and the first index of the R8 shadow map array has some type of sky/cloud shadow written inside the first R8 in the array. Then a geometry volume representing a light's casting range is rendered inside of the hardware depth stencil channel. Then the result is oddly refined by another geometry volume. That stencil channel is used to restrict expensive shadow map projection invocations on the R8 shadow mask mentioned before. The inputs are pretty simple. It's just the shadow map atlas, scene depth, and the shadow softening noise texture. Two more volumes imprint a new value in the stencil, which is used to prevent the corresponding shadow map pixel shading invocations in the second index of the R8 shadow mask buffer. Because this resource wasn't cleared, it is difficult to show the impact of the shadow map. A massive multi-purpose shader performs direct lighting and composites SSDO color bleeding, indirect lighting, and the RT reflection buffer in a native RGBA16, with what could potentially be scene luminance stored in the alpha channel. An RG11B10 is also outputted, but that's for materials that need screen space subsurface scattering, like skin, in which these two draws would scale with in terms of cost, but because there's no skin materials, it's empty and hardly any performance is lost. Then emissive materials are rendered again, which ends up having no effect on the alpha channel. The volumetric fog is updated and managed in this portion, and is composited on the lit frame in draw 1468, which induces significant changes in the alpha channel. CryEngine's fog hasn't really changed a whole lot, as indicated by a similar appearance seen in KCD2, which also had this IGN, or interleaved gradient noise patterns, coming from the fog. It just wasn't present in the capture we took for KCD2. It is without a doubt one of the most poor-looking volumetric fog systems out there because of this noise pattern. Even though I think there's very little use cases for blue noise, it's still better to use that in fog like Half-Life Alyx and Days Gone, instead of IGN. Transparents and sprite effects are rendered followed by some type of effect that uses the lowest resolution depth discontinuity buffer, rain occlusion map, and noise texture to produce this result, which is then blurred in two passes and used along several rain textures and the last frame's bloom RG11B10 to ensure raindrops are only seen in bright illuminated parts of the frame. Since the volumetric fog, many of these draws are affecting the alpha channel. A native RG11B10 has the RGBA16 scene copied into it, but the RG11B10 is never used again in this pipeline, though an exact copy of the RGBA16 scene is made in this draw and is used 9 draws later. Two half-resolution RGBA16s are created with depth-of-field related information, along with a depth-related texture that is mip-mapped in this section before being used to create near and far-field blurred half-resolution versions of the scene, which are then composited on the frame in the last draw of this section. That post-DOF result is blurred down into a 270p blurred texture. That texture is then used along several G buffers to create this 64x64 HDR luminance RG16, which is then averaged all the way down to a 1x1 RG16. Then that 270p texture is recycled and blurred down continuously until it overwrites the last frame's bloom RG11B10. The purpose of these draws are unclear, as the resources they affect have nothing to do with previous or following draws. The skin screen space SSS RG11B10 outputted by the lighting stage is cleared to hold some composite effects. The half-resolution RGBA16 depth discontinuity and that post-DOF blurred 270p image texture are used to create this half-resolution RGB10A2, which ends up being a completely blank image. This lookup table is created and managed in 2 draws and is then used in this tone mapping stage where bloom compositing also takes place. The RG8 unsigned integer used earlier is cleared for the next stage where SMA stores a 2-channel edge mask based on the tone-mapped RGB10A2 scene. The hardware depth stencil channel stores what pixels were affected by the first SMA pass to restrict pixel invocations in the next SMA blending stage. It writes the blending mask in a cleared RGBA16, which is then used alongside the tone-mapped frame to output the edge-smoothed result inside another RGB10A2. The SMA2TX pass is processed next, with the RGBA16 history alpha and the output alpha containing specific temporal information. This draw transfers the anti-aliased RGBA16 output into an RGBA8 with the screen composite effects stored in the RG11B10 along with some film grain. The next step simply renders the timeframe UI. Now, there are some issues in the pipeline we'll get into, but one of the things I want to point out here is that the total sum ended up being a 13.80 millisecond cost. But the in-demo performance with the debugger software overhead stated a median performance that was 30% faster. These timing inconsistencies have only happened in the past with Jedi Survivor. With Unreal Engine games, I can usually use commands to turn off parts of the pipeline one by one to get a more accurate timing, but for this analysis, my points about this demo are only enhanced. I definitely think the software ray tracing is bloating the debugger timings, but it's still going to give a good idea of where processing is the heaviest in this pipeline. And none of our major conclusions rely on smaller, that is, more accurate timings only gathered by real-time frame counters. So now that you have this data under your belt, take a look at one of these frames from the demo. It's the worst performing part of the benchmark, but it should confuse anyone who understands how rendering works, and ask, why is this shot performing so poorly in a demo that usually hits around 100 FPS on our setup? It's not the amount of pixels that need to be traced, as higher surface area RT frames run faster than this shot. The biggest difference is how much the rays don't really align with each other, due to more complex normals. But this frame also performs terribly because, again, the base pass has extreme issues with material data being overwritten, which would have been fixed with a partial prepass, which I ended up getting working on this demo using CryEngine commands in the user config file. As we can see, rendering the depth of these close objects is extremely fast. This prepass remains performant because it's not rendering everything in the scene, just certain objects beyond a certain size, therefore surface area threshold. When we render the retrospective objects in the base pass afterwards, expensive materials like this one, which use around 8 high-resolution, poorly compressed textures, now this material is only processed where it will be visible to the user by the end of the base pass. In other words, nothing overwrites it. Now, the ordering is sort of odd since this depth prepassed object renders in the middle of the base pass, and you would really want prepassed objects to render last in the base pass. This prepass ended up providing a 7% performance improvement for the entire scene. Almost an entire millisecond gained. And remember, we only have 16 milliseconds to work with if we want to hit 60 FPS in the worst case scenario. The next issue is anti-aliasing. Now, the temporal component was pretty conservative in comparison with more abusive pipelines, and that's why the fog noise is still present in the image. The more competent the TAA, the less it can be abused. But you can see clearly it's blurring out some detail, because it's averaging out so many pass frames in order to compensate because the standalone SMAA isn't working properly, as we can see in its standalone image. It's not smoothing basic edges. It's an issue we addressed a lot in our CryEngine revisit when we reviewed the deferred MSAA implementation in Crysis 3. Now, another thing I want to mention is how pixelated the very high performance RT tracing looks when the camera isn't moving. There are 2 different methods we can combine to resolve this issue. We can use blue noise sampling. Our Dead Space remake analysis discussed this in great detail. Here it works great in Jedi Survivor, which doesn't even use specular motion vectors, which we'll eventually discuss in another video. And Unreal, or at least 5.7, does have a superior reconstruction method for checkerboarded reflections by jittering the reflections and utilizing a semi-anti-aliasing independent denoiser. I say semi-independent on TAA because it officially relies on incompetent TAA because Epic pushes developers to render traces below that checkerboarded resolution, that quarter pixel count we mentioned earlier. Lumen reflections also support higher roughness reflections through blue noise scattered sampling, whereas this demo uses cube maps when lighting the reflections and rasterized geometry. These comparisons confirm an initial conclusion when analyzing Callisto Protocol that butchered rasterization, in this case bad Q maps, are more destructive to realism than no Q maps. Here we can see how ridiculously unoptimized the SSR is. There's no good reason for SSR to be surpassing the cost of ray tracing like it does here. The half resolution SSR shown here is still completely unoptimized. We know this for sure because this channel has measured the performance of superior implementations in past videos, as seen in the Phantom Pain, Frostbite titles, and even Crysis 3. There are so many aspects in which we can optimize compute shader ray tracing performance using the same cutbacks hardware ray tracing is using today. That is, unless you're using something like NVIDIA's fake path tracing. We have barely scratched the surface of what a scam hardware ray tracing is in this video, which is why we're going to revisit this topic in the future. But for now, you need to share this content on every platform possible, because more people need to remember what vendor-agnostic graphics are capable of. Post it in as many Discord servers and subreddits as possible. If you see it already posted in a community, post it again, because you will need to overwhelm moderators that defend anti-consumer tech cultures. NVIDIA's marketing bots are relentless, so we need to match NVIDIA's aggression. You also need to demand GPU reviewers to stop making hardware ray tracing comparisons because they feed that anti-consumer culture just as they've been feeding and blowing up the upscaling culture. They should be testing benchmarks like this, that is with settings mentioned in the pinned comment. Make sure to subscribe to raise the market value for vendor-agnostic optimization. And make sure to consider joining our Patreon because we are here to dominate in content creation and have that fund our development endeavors. But we can't produce videos as fast as the most successful content creators because this content requires such meticulous testing to back conclusions. If you join now, you'll be supporting one of our most massive projects yet. A project that is going to have profound effects on the industry. And what you're seeing on screen is the basic skeleton of that video. Make sure to keep your eyes peeled because that video will release with temporarily free materials to download before becoming Patreon exclusive content. So share it like crazy, hype people up for its release, and thank you for watching this video.